All right, so when I think about my life, we'll just see if this is working. Lectern. Good. No? Okay, here we go. So when I think about my career, it's kind of odd actually because I feel that it's come full circle. So as a kid, I spent a lot of time playing around with mud and sand. During my childhood, I went through the usual kind of phases of wanting to be a doctor, a nurse, a teacher. Somehow, I ended up doing a degree in science, and today, I'm back again playing in the mud. So, what is it that I actually do? Okay. So I like to call myself a benthic ecologist. Now this is probably a word that none of you have ever heard before. But looking at this slide and the 4 pictures that you see here, what do you reckon all 4 pictures have in common? And what do you think benthic might actually mean? Anyone? So benthic is actually just a really fancy word for meaning bottom dwelling. Okay, so you can see that everything in these pictures here are bottom dwelling, be it the snails that are found in the mudflat, be it the seagrass that's found on the bottom of our estuaries and bays, be it the kelp that's found at the bottom of the ocean, or the soldier crabs that are busy turning over this sand flat at low tide. So I guess my main research interest is those processes that maintain biodiversity and how natural processes and human activities are increasingly influencing biodiversity, which underpins many trillions of dollars worth of services that estuarine and coastal environments provide to us every year. So the way I address this question is often using field experiments. So these are experiments not done in the lab. These are experiments done outside in the real world. And the way I conduct these experiments is actually by manipulating the environment in carefully controlled ways and seeing how the system responds. So in this slide here, you can see an example of one of my experiments. This is Quibre Bay on the southern side of Botany Bay. Anyone from the Southern Shire down that way? No? Yes? So about an hour's drive from here, not very far away at all. And what you can see here are some predator exclusion cages. So what I can do is actually cordon off little sections of mudflat. If you look really closely, you'll see that some of these cages, these fences actually have mesh on top. And what this is doing is actually excluding the birds and fish and preventing them from feeding on the critters that are found in the sediment. And so if you think about the marine environment, one of the ongoing threats is overharvest of fish. And this might be problematic because fish are actually key predators in this system. And if you remove fish from the system, we might expect that changes in the trophic levels below might occur. So this is exactly what this experiment is doing, creating a predator-free world and seeing how the system responds. There are other things that I can easily do as well. For example, if I wanted to look at the effects of sewage discharge, nutrient input into estuaries, I can do experiments where I buy fertiliser from the hardware, I can wrap it up in little pantyhose balls and I can bury it in the sediment and the nutrient releases slowly and I can see what happens in that scenario. And then what we typically do is leave these interventions in place for maybe a period of 3 months and then we'll go back and we'll collect sediment cores. What we can do is sieve out all the sediment and look at all the critters that are found in the sediment and compare these to undisturbed places to see how the system has actually responded. Okay, so playing around in mud, why does it all matter? Well, many benthic organisms actually provide very, very important services. I think it's been estimated globally that coastal systems provide over $13 trillion worth of benefits to humans every year. Oh, this one's gone a bit funny. So what you'll actually have to imagine here is that we've got some oysters that sort of look like that. Anyone like eating oysters? No? A couple of people. Yeah, it's a bit of an acquired taste, isn't it? But even if you don't like eating oysters, you should care about oysters because oysters are critically important species. So you may know that oysters are actually a group of organisms called a filter feeder. So what they do is they have a set of gills, and what they're doing is passing water through their gills, and particles get trapped on the gills. Some of those particles they can actually use as a food resource, and others are just junk, and they actually poop them out into the sediment below. So through this process of actually filtering the water, oysters can actually help avoid this kind of situation here where the water's going poo brown from all the gunk in it, and help maintain this kind of scenario here where we've got nice clean water. Now this is especially important if you think about the primary producers in aquatic environments, things like seagrasses, things like seaweeds. Okay, obviously they need light in order to grow. Okay, and so they're not going to do too well in this poo brown. Whoops, what's going on here? Can we go back, please? Oop. Okay, sorry about that. The seagrasses and the primary producers aren't going to do very well in a system that is poo brown. They need light in order to grow. So oysters are very important in maintaining that kind of thing. As I said before, oysters, they're also concentrating particles that they can't use for food and pooping them out into the sediment below. But there are actually other things that can use oyster poop. Okay, and so there's all kinds of worms and snails and stuff like that. This is a bit funny. Okay, that actually you're able to use that material pooped out by oysters. And then finally, unfortunately, this slide has gone all funny, but what this was supposed to show is all kinds of fish and snails and worms that actually use oysters as habitat, because you can imagine they provide this three-dimensional structure with lots of nooks and crannies. And if you're a small fish, this is actually good because it provides protection for you against larger predators. Okay, so the problem is that we know that these systems are really, really critically important. As I've said before, you know, $13 trillion a year they're worth. And human activities are actually increasingly threatening the important role they play. So this is one example from close to home. This is a species of seaweed called the crayweed. Used to be found right up and down the New South Wales coast in water of maybe 2 or 3 metres depth, so just off the coast. But some colleagues of mine a couple of years back noticed that they hadn't really seen it around Sydney lately. And so what they did is they actually went and did a survey, diving, to actually see if this was indeed the case, that it had gone missing from Sydney. And this is indeed what they found. So on this slide here, we have got on the left-hand, so this is showing the percent cover of this species of seaweed on rocks off the coast. We've got to the north of Sydney on the left-hand side, Sydney in the middle, and to the south of Sydney on the right. Now, whereas in the past we would have found this seaweed right across the New South Wales coastline, you can see from this graph, Sydney seems to have gone missing. So we don't really know the reasons why it's gone missing. It's kind of interesting that about the period of time when people stopped actually noting it in their records was when some of the deep ocean sewage outfalls went online, and we do know that lots of early life history stages of seaweeds are very susceptible to sewage. So that is one possibility, though we actually haven't done the science yet to definitely establish that link. Okay, so you can imagine that this great big seaweed would be pretty important habitat for all kinds of critters out off the coast. All kinds of fish might hide in this habitat. It might provide protection from waves and currents for things that live around it. But so what's actually happened is that where this seaweed has gone missing, it's actually been replaced by other species. So this red arrow is indicating that this crayweed has declined. What we're seeing more and more is this other species of seaweed, sargassum, which can grow pretty fast, is coming in and taking its place. And to a lesser extent also this species of kelp down the bottom. Now, if you look at these three species, you notice that structurally they're probably a little bit different. And so the types of animals that use them and the role they play might differ among them. But actually, the other overlooked side of this is that actually a lot of the seaweed material actually isn't consumed by grazers. A lot of it, when there's a storm that comes through or when the seaweed reaches the end of its natural life, it actually becomes detached. And I'm sure you've been at the beach, you know, swimming, and there's all that seaweed that's in the surf and washing up on the shore. Yeah, everyone familiar with that? And, you know, it's often a bit annoying, you know, it's bashing up against you and there's often all kinds of critters in it, and, you know, you get sea lice and, you know, you think it's a bit of a pain in the neck. But actually, it's critically important to these marine systems. So what happens, as you probably know, is that it eventually washes up on the beaches. And on the beaches, it actually starts to decompose. And in decomposing, it's actually releasing all kinds of nutrients that support a whole range of little critters that are found in amongst it and in the sediments. And you can also imagine that in providing a lot of structure, it's actually providing protection to other organisms from things like birds that might otherwise come along and eat them. Okay, and typically this seaweed on the shore is actually a mix of a whole heap of different species. So you can imagine that the fact that this crayweed has gone missing from the coastline of Sydney might not only influence the fish that live in the seaweed itself, but actually whole ecosystems that depend on this seaweed washing up. So things like these little snails, these little worms, little baby crustaceans. Okay, so the way that I can address this question is again through these manipulative field experiments. And so what you can see one of my colleagues doing here is that we've collected a whole heap of this algae, this seaweed. By the time it gets incorporated into muddy sediments, it's often really fragmented and it's found in fine particles. So that's what we've done here. We've stuck it in the blender, given it a good old whiz, made seaweed puree, and here we are mulching it into the sediment. Okay, so nice massage of the mud. As I showed you before, basically leave it to sit here for 3 months and see what happens. Okay, so here are some of my results of such an experiment. So what I've done here is actually compare the crayweed, which is shown as P on this slide, with the two other seaweeds that I showed in that slide before. So the kelp and also that sargassum algae. And I did this with different volumes of material because after storms there tends to be more of this stuff that washes up. Sometimes there's lesser amounts. But the thing to take away from this slide is that there are many, many more invertebrates that are actually supported by this crayweed, which is the white bars, than the other two species. So in this species going missing from the coastline of Sydney, we're actually drastically changing whole ecosystems and whole suites of organisms. Okay, another example. So another thing that's increasingly occurring in the marine environment is loss of our sandy beaches. And people care about loss of sandy beaches because obviously, you know, it's nice to go there and go for a swim and, you know, walk your dog and do what you like to do. Also, lots of people have their houses built right by the shore too. So, you know, the sandy beach is kind of the protection between the sea and their home. And so what we're doing more and more of is actually taking sand from a dredge site. So it could be collecting sand from offshore or collecting sand from a building excavation site on land and actually depositing it on the beach to extend the beach seaward. Okay, so this is what you can see here. This is actually in North Carolina in the USA where I worked for a while. Okay, so you can see it's pretty destructive, you know, there's big pipes on the beach, there's bulldozers spreading it around. Okay, and this is just reinforcing the reason why, okay? So in the past we haven't always had good restrictions in terms of where we can build our houses, and so there are a lot of houses that are now in this kind of situation where they're about to be washed away by the sea. You probably have heard about climate change and the fact that this is causing sea levels to rise, and also in various parts of the world there's increased storminess. So this is tending to actually cause the beaches to retreat landward. Okay, so you can see that there's a problem when we've got houses like this. We've got beaches retreating landward because these houses are going to topple into the sea. Okay, so when you think about the sandy beach, you know, you don't usually think about it as being very biodiverse, do you? It sort of looks a bit like an ecological desert, doesn't it? But the really, really surprising thing about sandy beaches is that they actually contain more different types of organisms than the world's rainforests. Can you believe that? Pretty amazing. But most of these organisms are actually teeny tiny and found in amongst the grains of sand. So this is just my beach ecology slide, okay? So you can see here we've got the critters that are found in the beach, so the beach invertebrates, those yellow things. We've got various shorebirds that actually feed on the critters found in amongst the sand grains. We've got fishes that live in the shallow water that actually also live and eat on the worms that are found in the sand. We've got things like turtles that periodically come ashore and lay their eggs in beaches. We've got the dune system at the back, and we've got things like crabs actually burrowing into the sand dunes. Okay, so surprisingly enough, sandy beaches actually support these whole ecosystems. Now, the problem with this beach nourishment, where we're taking sediment from an external site and dumping it in the beach, is that it actually modifies the beach in a pretty big way. So if you look really closely in this slide, you might see that the water at the front is kind of a grey-brown colour, and you can see this line towards the back where the water changes colour to a blue or blue. So what you've actually seen here is a turbidity plume. So this is where sand has been dumped on the beach. It's contained a lot of mud in it, okay, and it's creating this big brown muddy slick in the water, which might take, you know, months to disappear. Okay, so the problem with this is that if we think about some of our little fish that are in the surf zone, in the shallow water and feeding, they're actually visual predators. This means that they need to be able to see what they're eating in order to feed. Okay, so they're consuming things like these little bivalves, these little shells and these little funny looking crabs. Okay, but if the water turns all kind of khaki brown like this, they're not actually going to be able to see what they're doing, and they might not be able to feed effectively anymore. The other way things can go is that if you imagine really coarse material with lots of rocks and lots of shell, if you're an engineer, it's kind of tempting to actually put this on a beach. Because it's heavy, it takes longer to erode away again. Okay, and in most countries, there's actually regulations that require them to try and match the sand that they're adding to the beach as carefully as possible. But for various reasons, this doesn't always happen. So this is another scenario that can happen, and again, this is a beach from the USA, where we've got very, very coarse material accumulating on the beach. Now, you can imagine that this might be a problem for the shorebirds that feed on the beach, because these have long beaks and they're having to penetrate between the grains of sand to get the worms and the little critters found in the beach. Okay, and if there's this big shell hash kind of barrier on the surface of the sediment, they're not going to be able to get in. Okay, so in this case, what I actually did was some Mesocosm experiments. So Mesocosm is just a fancy word for big tanks, and that's what you can see here. And so what I've done is actually manipulate the quality of the water. So you can see that there's some tanks that have very clear water. There's other tanks where I've added clay and made it that kind of, you know, turbid kind of colour that you saw in that previous slide. Okay, and then I've done experiments where I've compared the rate of predation of these fish on various snails and bivalves and things like that in the clear water versus the turbid water. And this is what I actually found. So looking at this slide, we've got the proportion of prey items that were consumed. So on the left, we've got the slide for crabs, and on the right, we've got the slide for the bivalves consumed. There's two treatments. So there's the control treatment, which is the pink bars, and this is the nice clear water. We've got the turbid water, which is the grey bars. So this is with all the clay in it. And in both cases, you can see that the fish actually ate more of either the crabs or the bivalves when they were in clear water than when they were in turbid water. So this is sending a clear message that this turbid water is bad for these fish. Okay, we can also do experiments where we do the reverse. So instead of manipulating water quality, we can actually manipulate the amount of shell hash on the sediment surface and see how this interferes with fish feeding. And this is, again, a similar graph showing the proportion of a particular prey item, a particular shell that's consumed in treatments where there's both sand and shell hash, which is the grey bar, and in treatments where there is sand only, so it doesn't have that physical barrier. And you can see pretty obviously here that the fish are actually eating many, many more of these shells where there is not the physical barrier that's preventing them from getting in. So this type of research is an important message for managers that when they're doing this kind of activity, they actually need to be thinking pretty carefully about the way that they're doing it, okay? If they're not matching the sediment well, if they're adding a lot of mud to the system, or if they're adding a lot of shell to the system, this is going to have pretty bad implications for the system. So that's just a bit of a taster of what I actually do. So why do I actually like my job? Well, it's probably been pretty clear from the slides that I've just shown you that I get to go outside a lot. And I'm really an outdoorsy kind of girl. I don't like to be stuck in an office. So this is one of the great things about my job. I get to go to really amazing places up and down the coastline. This is, has anyone been to Eden on the far south coast of New South Wales? So this is on the southern side of Twofold Bay there in this little lagoon. Gorgeous place. We had it all to ourselves setting up experiments there. Okay, so that's one of the good things. Another thing is I feel that I'm making a difference. So in doing these experiments, you know, I'm learning about how these ecological systems are actually responding to human activities. I can then go to the coastal managers and say, well, look, if we modify activities in these ways, then maybe we can minimise our impact on the marine environment. So I feel like I'm making a difference as well. The other reason why I really like my job is that I get to travel a lot. So these red dots here indicate all the different places where I've gone from work. So all around Australia, I've spent quite a lot of time in the US, in Mexico. I've done work in China on oysters over there. I have gone to conferences in Scotland and in Spain. So if you like travelling, science is a good thing for you. It's definitely a global industry. We're always travelling to keep on top of the latest advancements to work with colleagues overseas. So how did I actually get into my field? Well, actually, it was accident. So I was one of these people that really never knew what they were doing with their life. I just sort of fell from one thing to the next. I went to high school, and I think a few people from Fort Street here. I went to Fort Street High School a few years back. And I actually had a few really inspirational high school science teachers there, and pretty much enjoyed my science, and so ended up doing quite a lot of science for the HSC. And it got time to go to uni, and you know, I figured that, you know, I may as well go to uni, further my skills a bit, but I wasn't really sure what degree to do. So I was looking at a degree that was fairly broad because I didn't really have this well-defined career path in mind. So it sort of came back down to either arts or a science degree, both of which have incredible flexibility. And in the end, because I'd done lots of science at high school, I decided to go that way. In first year, I did a little bit of everything, a little bit of maths, a little bit of physics, a bit of chemistry, a bit of biology. And basically, by trying a little bit of everything, worked out that biology was really what I was interested in. I actually spent most of my degree thinking I wanted to work on plant cells. So actually sort of the opposite scale to what I was showing you here, you know, staring down the microscope all the time, looking at how cells talk to one another. But in third year, I actually went on this field trip for a week, and we went to Pearl Beach. Don't know if any of you have holidays there, but great spot. And we went out on the rock platform every day, and we were designing our own little experiments and doing surveys of biodiversity there. And it was the middle of winter, it was about 12 degrees, it poured with rain the whole week, the wind was blowing a gale, but for some reason I really, really enjoyed this experience. I think, you know, I felt like I could do this, and it was hands-on, and I was actually doing real science. So from there, decided to do a year of honours. So honours is an independent research project that you can opt to do at the end of your degree to further build your research skills. And then decided, yes, this was something that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing, and so went on and did a PhD. So here's the pathway. So high school, did maths and science. I did a Bachelor of Science at University, which I cannot recommend highly enough. Very, very flexible degree. You can pick and choose exactly what you want to do. You can even do art subjects as well. So, you know, if you think you want to do a bit of music on the side or a language, completely possible to do with a Bachelor of Science. There's my honours, my independent research project, and then went on to do a PhD. So a PhD is just basically, I guess, a job as a trainee scientist. So you're doing research under the eye of a supervisor, and you're getting paid a small amount of money to do it as well. Okay, so that's my career and how I got there. If anyone has any questions about what I do or how I got there or what's involved or what you should be doing now, I'm available to answer a few questions. Thanks.
I have a question to start for Melanie. So you said your research allows you to travel around.
Yep.
Has it allowed you to work with any other partners across, from Australia or across the globe? Do you ever partner up with someone else from another university or another research team to conduct your research?
Yes, so this is the really great thing about science. You probably have this mental image of science as someone in a white lab coat working away in a corner in a lab. It's not actually like that at all. It's a very collaborative type of field. We're constantly working in teams, working with other people. So the existing projects I have, I've got people in Sydney from other universities that I'm presently working with. I've got people from other universities in Australia. So I recently hosted a workshop in December that involved people from Queensland, from Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania. I hosted another workshop in January that involved people from the USA, Canada, New Zealand, setting up experimental research programs where we're doing the same experiments all around the world to see how things are the same or different in the way they function in different places. As I mentioned before, I actually got to work for 2 years in the USA. I had a job there at one of the universities. So definitely it is by no means at all the stereotypical scientist working away in the corner. It's very collaborative. You definitely get to get out there and meet lots of people. I also work very closely with industry. So I've got projects going with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, so working with people that are responsible for managing the environment, for managing fisheries. I've got projects with South Coast communities. So yes, there are definitely lots of opportunities.
Are there more ladies than men in the area you work in, or?
So I am actually really, really fortunate in that my department at Macquarie is quite abnormal in that we are very female dominated. I guess both in a numbers perspective and actually in a leadership perspective as well. So I have some really fantastic female mentors here. Yep. Yep.
I was wondering if you were hired by the university to do the researches and experiments, or is this a private thing, like you just being a scientist individually and you can do experiments and research anytime you want during the year?
Yeah, so my job, I am employed by Macquarie University, and my job involves doing research for 40% of the time. 40% of the time I actually spend teaching, so if any of you end up coming to Macquarie, you might see me in second year. I teach ecology to second year students, and we go away on this really fun field trip for 10 days where we get to get out and get dirty. And then 20% of my job is actually contributing to the community and helping inform debates on things like marine parks and stuff. The really great thing about my job is that it's really flexible, so I can work on whatever research in the world that tickles my fancy. It's a very flexible job. I can start my workday when I want. I can end my workday when I want. So, you know, if I'm not a mornings person, I can start work at 12 and, you know, work till 9 at night. Conversely, if I want to enjoy the afternoon, I can start at 6 in the morning and finish, by mid-afternoon. So it's really great in that perspective.
Have you ever got bitten by anything?
So actually, one of the things that really caught me by surprise was when I was doing this experiment in the USA. And does anyone eat blue swimmer crabs?
Yes.
Yeah, so they're sort of feisty buggers, aren't they? Has anyone tried to pick up a blue swimmer crab? Well, there's a similar crab in the USA called a blue crab. So very similar name, looks very similar. And I was doing these experiments with these crabs, comparing, I guess, the number of native oysters they consumed and the number of non-native oysters they consumed. And I had them in tanks. And anyway, the tanks were about this deep. And I had my arms sort of resting over the tank. And, the crab was that far below. So, I thought, I'll be right. And the bugger actually jumped up and caught hold of my hand. And I got such a surprise that it was still attached to my finger. I went wham, and the poor crab went flying across the room.
What was your favourite, coastline to study?
So actually, I mostly work in New South Wales and around Sydney. And, I guess a lot of people ask me, why don't you work on the Great Barrier Reef? A lot of marine scientists work with the corals and the pretty tropical fish. But actually, if we think about the southern Australian coastline, it actually has a much greater biodiversity, a much more unique biodiversity than our Great Barrier Reef. We've got, I think, 85% of the species in southeastern Australia aren't actually found anywhere else in the world. I actually really enjoy working close to home. I mean, it's great to have been able to have the opportunity to work elsewhere, but, I think we're really fortunate in what we've got just on our doorstep here. Yeah, so I guess particularly with the field experiments, the concern is always the member of the public that goes, hey, what's this? I want to wreck it. So actually during my PhD, I had this experiment, and my PhD, I was actually looking at the waves produced by the ferries that go up and down the Parramatta River and what impact that has on the critters that are living in the sediment and the role of the mangroves in helping to reduce those impacts by stabilising the sediment and dissipating wave energy and that kind of thing. And so I had these experiments sort of set up, in quite urban areas, so sort of Western Parramatta River, so Silverwater, Ermington, Rydalmere, those kind of places. And anyway, I had this experiment. I had little containers out with different types of sediment and been out there for 3 months, and I go along every 2 weeks and see how everything was doing. And 1 week before I was supposed to sample the experiment, and I collect my final data, I went along and someone had gone and taken every one of those containers and turned it over. So things do happen, and as a scientist, you do have to, I guess, be tough and pick yourself up again. Fortunately, that kind of thing doesn't happen that much. Far and away, most people actually leave things alone. Part of the reason why I work in mud is that other people don't like to go there. And so people don't tend to mess with my experiments, because if they mess with my experiments, they themselves have to get all muddy and dirty.